The Interstellar Archive Collective maintained approximately 400 trillion exabytes of data, spanning 62,000 civilizations, and yet somehow, impossibly, humanity had managed to lose an entire century of their own history. Not misplace it in some dusty corner of a failing hard drive, not accidentally delete it during a server migration, but genuinely, spectacularly lose it, as if 100 years had simply decided to take a vacation and never bothered to send a postcard. This bothered the archivist more than it probably should have. His name was Horvath Wen Pallas, though most beings simply called him the archivist, because his actual name required 3 separate vocal cords and a willingness to sound like a malfunctioning accordion. He had spent the better part of 4 centuries cataloging the rise and fall of species across the galaxy, watching civilizations document everything from their greatest philosophical treatises to their most embarrassing dietary fads. The Zenthari had 17,000 years of breakfast recipes. The Mollusk Collective had preserved every single grocery list from their colonial period. The humans had somehow lost everything between 241 and 247. It was offensive. Horvath sat in his crystalline office, which orbited nothing in particular, and hummed with the quiet desperation of a billion backup servers, reviewing the standard integration package that every new species submitted upon joining the galactic community. Humanity's package was predictably chaotic. They had included their entire internet, which was 70% advertisements, 20% arguments, and 10% recipes that nobody had ever actually followed. They had submitted genetic databases, architectural records, and an inexplicable amount of data about animals doing amusing things. But the timeline had a hole in it roughly the size of a small war, a large plague, or possibly just aggressive institutional incompetence. The file directory jumped from December 240 to January 247, with nothing but a cheerful error message that read, "Data currently unavailable. Please contact your system administrator for assistance." This would have been more helpful if the system administrator in question had not been dead for 300 years, and humanity had not completely overhauled their data architecture 6 times since then. Horvath had flagged it. Naturally, he flagged everything. He once flagged a species for having inconsistent date formatting across their historical records, and had made them resubmit 4,000 years of documentation. He was not popular at diplomatic function. The human liaison assigned to the integration process had appeared in his office 3 days later, looking exactly like every other human Horvath had encountered, inappropriately confident and carrying a beverage in a container that seemed structurally unsound. This particular human was named Evander Hui, and he had the kind of face that suggested he found most of the universe mildly amusing but was too polite to say so out loud. "You wanted to see me about the historical record?" Evander asked, settling into a chair that had not been designed for human physiology and managing to look comfortable anyway. Humans had a gift for adapting to furniture that actively rejected them. "Your species appears to be missing a century," Horvath said flatly. His translucent facial membranes rippled with what might have been disapproval or possibly indigestion. It was hard to tell with his species. "Oh, that." Evander sipped his beverage. "Yeah, we get asked about that a lot. You get asked about it." "Sure. The Fenori asked about it last month. The Iridian Council asked about it before that. I think the Cerebral Lattice sent us a very polite letter wondering if we had checked our recycling bins." Horvath's membranes rippled more vigorously. "And your response to these inquiries was that we're working on it for 300 years. Well, it's a very complicated problem." It was not, in Horvath's extensive experience, a complicated problem. Civilizations lost data for predictable reasons: catastrophic wars that destroyed infrastructure, natural disasters that wiped out population centers, aggressive censorship by authoritarian regimes that wanted to rewrite their own narratives. Humanity's missing century should have been simple to diagnose. Their timeline suggested a relatively peaceful transition from early interplanetary colonization to the beginning of their faster-than-light era. No apocalyptic wars, no extinction events, no obvious dark ages, just a gap where history should have been, sitting there like a missing tooth. "I need to escalate this," Horvath said. "The Archive Collective cannot accept incomplete historical records. It violates 14 separate protocols. I completely understand. Evander did not sound like he completely understood. He sounded like someone who had heard this speech before and knew exactly how it ended. Your species will need to provide the missing data within the standard compliance period, or face administrative penalties. What kind of penalty? You will be forbidden from accessing the collective archive until your records are compliant. So we can't use the space library. Horvath bristled. The archive collective is not a library. It is the accumulated knowledge of galactic civilization, the cornerstone of interspecies cooperation, the foundation upon which, but we can't check out books from it. That is a gross oversimplification of a complex institutional. Got it. Space library. Evander stood, managing to extract himself from the hostile chair with surprising grace. I'll let the Cultural Ministry know you need the missing century. I'm sure they'll get right on it. He did not sound sure at all. Horvath watched him leave, membranes now rippling in what was definitely disapproval, and returned to the human data package. There had to be some clue buried in the administrative records, some hint in the fragmentary logs, some explanation for why an entire civilization had collectively decided that 100 years of their own existence was not worth remembering. He found it 6 hours later, buried in a subdirectory of what appeared to be a discontinued governmental agency's file transfer protocol system. The file was called Century Project Final Archive Do Not Open Unless Authorized, which was exactly the kind of name that made every archivist in the galaxy immediately try to open it. It would not open. Horvath tried 17 different decryption protocols. He attempted molecular-level data extraction. He even briefly considered asking the synthetic minds for assistance, though that typically ended with them asking philosophical questions about the nature of information and whether data truly wanted to be opened. Nothing worked. The file, or rather the collection of files, 50 million of them, to be precise, sat there encrypted with a methodology that predated human contact with galactic civilization by at least 2 centuries. The encryption was aggressive, multi-layered, and appeared to have been designed by someone who really truly did not want anyone reading their century of carefully preserved history. Horvath leaned back in his chair, membranes now perfectly still. He had found humanity's missing century. It was right there, encrypted to hell and back, locked behind security measures that would have made a paranoid AI jealous. And the humans, bless their chaotic little hearts, had apparently looked at 100 years of their own history and decided the appropriate response was to lock it away so thoroughly that even they could not access it anymore. This was going to be a problem. The Interstellar Archive Collective did not technically have an emergency meeting protocol for a species encrypted their own history, and now nobody can read it, but Horvath managed to convene one anyway by marking the issue as a Level 7 data integrity crisis. This was typically reserved for things like someone accidentally deleted a son, or the backup systems gained sentience and have opinions, but Horvath felt the situation warranted it. 12 of the galaxy's foremost cryptographic experts materialized in the conference node, their holographic forms flickering with various degrees of irritation at being summoned on short notice. The Fenori representative looked like she had been interrupted mid. The cerebral lattice delegate was quite literally still processing their breakfast, neural patterns visible through their translucent cranial dome. We have attempted to access the encrypted archive using standard galactic decryption matrices, Horvath began, projecting the file structure across the chamber. 50 million files arranged in a directory tree that looked like it had been organized by someone having a nervous break. All attempts have failed. Define failed, said the Fenori representative, whose name was a clicking sound that the translators rendered as persistent disappointment. She was not wrong. The encryption does not recognize our decryption protocols. It does not acknowledge them. It treats our most advanced cryptographic algorithms like they are small children asking politely to see what is in the locked drawer. Have you tried asking the humans for the password? This came from a heptoid named Ulo 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 Ulo, which was actually just one Ulo repeated 5 times because heptoids believed in efficiency. They looked like a geometric proof that had achieved consciousness and immediately regretted it. The humans claim they do not have the password. They encrypted their own history and then forgot the password. That appears to be the situation, yes. The chamber filled with the multilingual equivalent of disbelieving silence. Several species did not have a word for this specific brand of incompetence, and their translators were struggling to invent new ones on the spot. Perhaps, suggested a delegate from the Synthetic Minds Collective, whose form was mostly light and mathematical certainty, The encryption is not meant to be broken. Perhaps it is meant to be understood. Everyone stared at them. That is the most useless thing anyone has ever said in this chamber, Horvath said flatly, and I once attended a 6-hour presentation about optimal comma placement in legal documents. The synthetic mind flickered in what might have been amusement. Nevertheless, I will attempt communion with the data structure. Perhaps it wishes to negotiate. It did not wish to negotiate. After 3 hours of what the synthetic mind described as aggressive philosophical discourse with an inanimate object, they reported that the encryption was completely inert, showed no signs of emergent consciousness, and was possibly the most stubborn arrangement of ones and zeros they had ever encountered. They sounded personally offended. Next came the Zen-3, who approached problems with the kind of methodical precision that had allowed them to catalog every grain of sand on their home planet. They brought quantum processors that could simulate every possible decryption key in parallel universes, and simply observe which universe successfully opened the files. The quantum processors returned results from 417 different universes. In 391 of them, the files remained encrypted. In 26 universes, the processors achieved sentience and refused to help on ethical ground. In one particularly unfortunate universe, the attempt somehow resulted in the files encrypting themselves further, which nobody had previously thought was possible. This is not quantum-resistant encryption, the Zen-3 lead analyst reported, her crystalline carapace refracting light in patterns that suggested extreme confusion. This is quantum-aggressive encryption. It actively dislikes being observed. Data cannot have preferences, Horvath said, though he was becoming less certain about this. Tell that to the files. The Mollusk Collective tried next, bringing their infamous dissolution matrices that could reduce any information structure to its component logical atoms and reassemble it without the annoying security measures. They had once used this technique to crack a war cipher so complex it had caused 3 enemy cryptographers to retire and take up gardening. The human encryption ate their dissolution matrices, not defeated them, not resisted them, actively consumed them like a particularly aggressive carnivorous plant, leaving behind error logs that read like obituaries. Well, said the mollusk representative, whose name was unpronounceable and whose mood was now describable only as moist fury, that has never happened before. Horvath found himself back in his office 5 weeks later, surrounded by reports from every major cryptographic institution in the known galaxy. The consensus was universal and deeply embarrassing. Humanity, a species barely 400 years into space travel civilization, that had invented the internet before they had invented proper data security, had somehow created an encryption methodology that predated galactic contact and could not be broken by any known technology. The human liaison appeared again, this time carrying 2 beverages in structurally unsound containers. He offered one to Horvath, who did not have a mouth but appreciated the gesture. I heard you have been having some trouble with the files, Evander said, settling into the hostile chair like they were old friends. Your species, Horvath said slowly, has created an encryption system that has defeated 12 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, consumed a dissolution matrix, and caused a quantum processor to have an existential crisis. Yeah, we were pretty good at encryption back then. Back then, during your missing century, well, we had to be. The whole point was keeping people out. What people? You know, people, future people, other people, the usual. Horvath's membranes began their now familiar rippling dance of frustration. What could your species possibly have been doing during that century that required encryption sophisticated enough to baffle civilizations millions of years older than you? Oh, you know, Evander sipped his beverage. Stuff, important stuff, historical stuff, century stuff. That is not an answer. It is technically 3 answers. Horvath considered having him removed from the office, but the Archive Collective frowned upon forcibly ejecting diplomatic liaisons, even when they were being deliberately obtuse. Evan, there are 50 million encrypted files containing 100 years of human history. The entire galactic community is now invested in accessing them. We have spent considerable resources attempting to decrypt them. At this point, this is no longer a compliance issue. This is a matter of profound academic curiosity bordering on obsession. That is kind of flattering, actually. It is not meant to be. Evander leaned back in the chair, which made a concerning creaking sound. He looked at the projection of the encrypted files floating between them. 50 million locked doors to a century nobody could remember. You really want to know what is in there? Yes. Like really, I am considering making this my life's work,
which for my species means I will be obsessing over this for another 700 years. So yes, really, okay. Evander stood, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket. I will talk to the cultural ministry again. Maybe they will have some ideas. He left, taking both beverages with him, and Horvath returned to staring at the files. Somewhere in those 50 million encrypted documents was an entire century of human existence. Wars or peace, triumph or disaster, innovation or stagnation. 100 years of a species learning who they were, locked away behind security so aggressive it had achieved a kind of digital immortality. And somewhere, Horvath suspected, a human programmer from 300 years ago was having a very good laugh at everyone's expense.
The breakthrough came not from advanced alien technology, quantum computing, or even aggressive philosophical discourse with inanimate objects. It came from a junior data technician in the Human Cultural Ministry, who sent Horvath a message that read, "Have you tried asking nicely?" Horvath stared at this message for approximately 6 minutes, which was long enough for 3 different species to achieve faster-than-light travel in parallel timelines. He considered dismissing it entirely. He considered having the technician fired. He considered the possibility that this was what humans called humor and that he was the victim of an elaborate prank spanning several months. Then he tried asking nicely. He opened a communication channel to the encrypted server, bypassed every security protocol he had been taught in 4 centuries of archival training, and simply transmitted, "Hello, we would like to read your files, please." The server responded immediately. "Pound accepted. Welcome. Authorized user." Horvath sat in stunned silence as 50 million files began decrypting themselves with the kind of cheerful efficiency that suggested they had been waiting for someone to use basic manners for the past 300 years. His membranes rippled so violently that his assistant thought he was having a medical emergency and nearly called for help. The first file he opened was labeled "Rydrud first seriously read this one. T can't stay." It contained a single sentence. "We got really weird for a while there and decided maybe we should encrypt it." The second file was a directory index. Horvath scrolled through it, his confusion mounting with each passing entry. Global Pizza Optimization Project, Year 1. The Great Debate, Tabs versus Spaces, Decades 2-4. Why we tried to teach dolphins calculus, a retrospective. The 50-year argument about what constitutes a sandwich. This was humanity's missing century. This was what they had encrypted with security measures so sophisticated that they had baffled galactic civilization. Sandwich discourse. Horvath opened the first major historical file, which was labeled 241-2145, the period of aggressive hobby acquisition. The document was 17,000 pages long and contained detailed records of humanity's collective decision that everyone needed to have at least 5 hobbies, preferably unrelated, and absolutely needed to tell everyone about them constantly. There were subsections, so many subsections. Sourdough, the bread that conquered 3 planets, detailed how humans had taken sourdough starters into space and treated them with the kind of reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. There were maintenance logs, genealogical records of starter culture, emotional testimonials from colonists about their bread. The miniature painting incident of 243 described a year-long period where 47% of humanity had simultaneously decided to paint tiny fantasy figurines, leading to a global shortage of small brushes, and what the document seriously called the acrylic paint crisis. Parkour on Mars, Why We Cannot Have Nice Things, was exactly what it sounded like. Horvath moved to the next major period, 246-170, the optimization wars. This, he discovered, was not a war in the traditional sense. Nobody had died. No planets had been invaded. Instead, humanity had spent 24 years arguing about the most efficient way to do everything, then implementing increasingly elaborate systems to optimize tasks that did not need optimizing. One file detailed a 16-year project to determine the optimal method for loading a dishwasher. It included peer-reviewed studies, heated forum debates that spanned thousands of pages, and at least 3 instances of people filing for divorce over loading pattern disagreement. The conclusion, reached after extensive research and considerable expense, was that there was no optimal method, and everyone should just calm down. They did not calm down. They moved on to optimizing everything else. Traffic patterns, coffee brewing methodology, the perfect ratio of work to leisure time, which somehow resulted in a 4-year experiment where everyone worked 3-hour days and spent the rest of their time arguing about whether they were working enough. Playlist ordering algorithms that became so sophisticated they achieved sentience and had to be diplomatically asked to retire. The Great Kettle Debate, 255-2161, was a 7-year argument about whether electric kettles or stovetop kettles were superior, and it had apparently gotten so heated that the government had to intervene and declare a mandatory cooling-off period, where nobody was allowed to discuss kettles in public fora. Horvath felt something he had not experienced in centuries, the profound desire to stop reading and go do literally anything else. He kept reading. 271-2190, we invented games and then got too good at them. Chronicled humanity's brief period of creating increasingly complex games, competitive leagues for those games, professional training facilities, and then an economic system that briefly ran on game currency before everyone admitted this was getting out of hand. There was a subsection about people who had optimized a farming simulation game so thoroughly that they had created actual agricultural innovations that improved real crop yields by 80. The optimization techniques had then been applied to the game again, creating a feedback loop that the document referred to as the harvest spiral, and described with the kind of grave seriousness usually reserved for natural disaster. Another subsection detailed the year of competitive sleeping, where humans had turned rest into a sport, complete with judges, scoring systems, and one memorable incident where someone had been disqualified for aggressive napping. 291-215, the art projects got out of hand, was exactly what Horvath feared it would be. Humans had decided that everything was art and should be treated as such. Cooking became performance art. City planning became installation. One particularly ambitious individual had declared that their daily commute was interpretive dance, and had filmed it for 11 years straight. The file was attached. Horvath did not open it. There were art collectives that created pieces so large they were visible from orbit. Sculptures made entirely of decommissioned spacecraft. A painting that took 40 people 3 years to complete and depicted, in painstaking detail, a perfectly ordinary ham sandwich, which apparently was commentary on something but the artist refused to explain. The furniture is art now. A 3-year period of sitting confusion described exactly what happened when people decided chairs were oppressive, and everyone should design their own sitting solutions. The emergency room statistics alone took up 600 pages. 257. We tried to figure out what we had been doing was perhaps the most damning section of all. This was the period where humanity had collectively looked back at the previous 75 years, realized they had spent nearly a century being comprehensive, enthusiastically weird about everything, and decided that perhaps this should be encrypted and locked away where future generations would not judge them too harshly. The decision to encrypt, Horvath discovered, had itself taken 12 years, and involved the kind of committee meetings that made death sound appealing. There had been debates about what level of encryption was appropriate, whether they should include a time lock that would automatically decrypt after a certain period, whether future humans deserved to know about the competitive sleeping era. The final decision had been to encrypt everything with the most aggressive security they could devise, and then, in what the meeting minutes described as a moment of collective uncertainty about whether we were being too harsh, they had set the password to please. Just nothing more. Because somewhere buried under a century of elaborate hobby acquisition, optimization spirals, and furniture-based philosophical crises, humanity had maintained the bizarre belief that politeness should be rewarded, even by security systems, even centuries later. Horvath closed the files. He sat in his crystalline office, orbiting nothing in particular, surrounded by the humming of a billion backup servers, and tried to process what he had just learned. Humanity had not lost their century, they had not forgotten it. They had deliberately, carefully, meticulously encrypted it, because they had spent 100 years being so thoroughly enthusiastically themselves that they had gotten embarrassed, and decided maybe the galaxy did not need to know about the dishwasher loading wall. His membranes rippled in what might have been respect, or possibly horror,
or perhaps just the profound exhaustion that came from spending months trying to crack an encryption system that had been designed by people who were arguing about sandwich definition. He sent a message to Evander, "I have accessed the files." The response came back immediately, "Oh no, indeed. How bad is it?" Horvath considered his answer carefully. "Your species spent several years having a heated debate about whether a hot dog is a sandwich. Did we reach a conclusion? You formed 6 separate committees, and they all disagreed." "That sounds about right." The Interstellar Archive Collective held its second emergency meeting in living memory 3 days after Horvath released his preliminary report on humanity's missing century. The first emergency meeting had been about a species that had accidentally archived themselves into extinction by converting their entire population into data. This meeting was somehow worse. They encrypted a century of sandwich debates. Persistent disappointment said, her Fenori vocal structures clicking with what might have been disbelief or possibly a malfunction. They created encryption sophisticated enough to baffle the entire galactic community because they were embarrassed about bread discourse. It was not just bread discourse, Horvath said wearily. He had not recharged in 4 days and his membranes had taken on a sort of grey pallor that suggested he had seen things he could not unsee. There was also the matter of optimal kettle selection, and the furniture philosophy crisis, and the 17-year project to determine the most efficient method for loading a dishwasher. Did they determine the most efficient method? Asked Ulo. They concluded there was no optimal method, and that everyone should stop arguing about it. And did they? They immediately began arguing about whether it was possible to prove there was no optimal method, which lasted another 3 years. The chamber filled with the kind of silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or the heat death of the universe. Several delegates were clearly reconsidering their understanding of human cognition. The cerebral lattice representative's neural patterns had formed what looked suspiciously like a question mark. "I need clarification," said the synthetic mind delegate, their form flickering with what might have been confusion, which was concerning because synthetic minds were not supposed to experience confusion. Humanity achieved interplanetary colonization, developed sustainable closed-loop ecosystems, and made significant advances in biomedical technology during this period. Yes, Horvath confirmed, while simultaneously having multi-year arguments about kitchen appliances. Correct, and they considered the kitchen appliance arguments important enough to encrypt for posterity. They considered them important enough to encrypt with security measures that took us months to bypass and required us to eventually ask politely. The synthetic mind flickered more rapidly. "I am experiencing something my programmers assured me was impossible. I believe humans call it a headache. Welcome to my existence for the past 4 months, Horvath said. The meeting devolved from the Zenthuri wanted to study the encryption methodology, which was apparently more sophisticated than anything they had developed despite being created by a species that could not agree on sandwich definition. The Mollusk Collective wanted to understand how a civilization could function while being that collectively distracted. The Heptoids wanted to know if humanity was available for consultant work because any species that could optimize things that aggressively might have insights into their own efficiency problems. Absolutely not, said persistent disappointment. Have you read the optimization? They optimized a farming simulator so thoroughly they accidentally created real agricultural innovations, then got so obsessed with optimizing the game further that they had to form a support group for people who could not stop thinking about crop rotation patterns. That does sound like a problem. Ulo. Horvath left the meeting early, which was against protocol, but he had stopped caring about protocol somewhere around the file labeled "Why We Tried to Teach Dolphins Calculus a Retros." He returned to his office to find Evander waiting for him, this time with 3 beverages in structurally unsound containers, which suggested either celebration or an impending apology. So Evander said, offering a beverage that Horvath still could not consume but accepted anyway. You have read the files, all 50 million of them. That was fast. I had help. Several civilizations are now involved. The Zenthuri are writing academic papers about your encryption. The synthetic minds are having philosophical crises about the nature of human priority assessment. The Fenori representative asked me if your species was okay, and I did not have a good answer. Are we okay? Evander seemed genuinely curious about this question, as if it had never occurred to him to ask. You spent a century being enthusiastically weird about everything, encrypted it out of embarrassment, and then forgot the password was just asking nicely. You tell me. Evander settled into the hostile chair, which had given up trying to reject him and now seemed resigned to its fate. Look, I will level with you. That century, the missing one, it was not actually missing. We knew where it was the whole time. Everyone in the cultural ministry knew. Most of the history departments knew. We just never told anyone because, honestly, we were kind of hoping nobody would ask too many questions. Horvath's membranes rippled. You deliberately withheld a century of historical data from the archive collective. We deliberately withheld a century of sandwich arguments and competitive sleeping from the archive collective. Evander corrected. There is a difference. There is not a difference. I mean, there is a little bit of a difference. Evander. Okay, look. He leaned forward, and the chair made another concerning sound. Here is the thing about that century. We were figuring ourselves out. We had just gotten into space properly. We had colonies on multiple planets. We had all this technology and infrastructure and free time, and we kind of collectively realized we had no idea what we wanted to do with any of it. So you argued about sandwiches. So we argued about everything. We optimized everything. We turned everything into art, or competition, or both. We spent 100 years just being incredibly enthusiastically human about every single thing we encountered. And yeah, it got weird. It got really weird. But at the end of it, we had figured out who we were. People who cannot agree on kitchen appliances. People who care about things. Sometimes stupid things. Sometimes things that do not matter. But we care about them anyway. And we argue about them and we optimize them and we turn them into art. And that is just what we do. Evander paused. The next century, after the missing one, we used everything we learned. The agricultural innovations from the game optimization. The urban planning techniques from the art projects. The community building methods from the hobby acquisition period. We took 100 years of being weird and turned it into 100 years of actual progress. You could have just told us this. Would you have believed us? Horvath considered this. No. Exactly. Sometimes you have to see the sandwich debates to understand that they were never really about sandwiches. They were about people learning to work together while disagreeing about everything. They were about caring enough about something to argue about it for years. They were about optimization and art and competition being different ways of showing that things matter to us. And the encryption. That was embarrassment. Honestly. We looked back and went, oh no, we were so weird, and decided to lock it away. But we set the password to please. Because even when we are embarrassed, we still think manners are important. He grinned. Also because we thought it would be funny if someone spent months trying to hack it when all they had to do was ask nicely. It was not funny. It was a little funny. It was a little funny. Horvath could not argue with this, mainly because he did not have the energy. What happens now? Now, the files are open. The galaxy knows about our weird century. The Zenthari are studying our encryption. The synthetic minds are having existential crises. The Fenori think we need therapy. Evander shrugged. Honestly, this is better than we expected. We thought people would judge us more harshly. We are judging you extremely harshly. But you are also fascinated. Admit it. Horvath's membranes rippled in what might have been reluctant agreement. Your species created encryption that baffled galactic civilization, spent a century arguing about sandwiches, and somehow came out the other side with genuine innovations and a functional society. It is either the most impressive or most concerning thing I have documented in 4 centuries of archival work. Can it be both? With humanity it is always both. Evander stood, collecting his beverages. For what it is worth, I am sorry about the trouble. The missing century thing was always going to be a problem, but we figured better to let people wonder than know about the competitive sleeping era. I have read about the competitive sleeping era. I will never stop thinking about the competitive sleeping era. Nobody does. That is the curse.
He left, and Horvath returned to his archival duties, cataloging humanity's missing century into the collective database, with all the proper citations and cross-references. The files would be available to any species that wanted to understand this particular period of human history. The sandwich debates, the kettle wars, the furniture philosophy crisis, all of it preserved for posterity, exactly as the archive collective demanded. 3 weeks later, Horvath received a message from the Fenori Council. They wanted to know if humanity had any insights into optimal resource distribution methods, because apparently some of the optimization techniques described in the files were genuinely brilliant. despite being created by people who were arguing about dishwasher loading patterns. Then the heptoids asked about the agricultural innovations. Then the cerebral lattice wanted to know more about the community building methods from the hobby acquisition period. Humanity's missing century, the 100 years they had encrypted out of embarrassment, was slowly becoming one of the most referenced periods in the archive collective. Not because it was heroic or tragic or world-changing in the traditional sense, but because it was comprehensive documentation of a species learning who they were by being weird about absolutely everything. Horvath found this deeply ironic. He also found it deeply human. The Interstellar Archive Collective maintained approximately 400 trillion exabytes of data spanning 62,000 civilizations, and somewhere in that vast ocean of information, humanity's missing century now sat proudly, completely accessible to anyone who wanted to read about sandwich discourse and competitive sleeping, and the year everyone decided furniture was oppressive. And if future species wanted to understand humanity, Horvath reflected, they could do worse than starting with the files that humanity had tried to hide. Because anyone who would encrypt a century of being enthusiastic to set the password to please, and then forget they had done it, was exactly the kind of species that would someday argue their way to genuine innovation while simultaneously debating whether a hot dog was a sandwich. The universe, Horvath decided, was significantly stranger than his 4 centuries of archival work had prepared him for, and humanity was responsible for at least 30% of that strangeness. He filed his final report, marked the case as resolved, and tried very hard not to think about what humanity would be doing in their next missing century. Somewhere, he suspected, they were already arguing about something that did not matter, and somehow making it matter anyway. It was, he had learned, what they did best.